let's move
Yeah.
on to the 1983 NFL draft. Um, so a lot of storylines in this draft and a lot of moving pieces, and there's a lot happening. You do a fantastic job of breaking it down in the book. For the audience here, can you just give us kind of the state of the NFL during that draft? There's some stuff with the commissioner, with the USFL, led by a guy who might be prominent nowadays. So there's a lot of underlying storylines that are even beyond the whole, what team is drafting who where. So maybe let's start with some of those storylines and we'll get into how the draft actually plays out.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's first of all, there's like this competition between baseball and football. People don't understand football still hadn't quite cemented itself as the number one sport in America. Baseball was still up there. And there's definitely a competition going on between the two sports. So Pete Rozelle, who was the commissioner at the time, has a meeting with Elway's agent as Elway is trying to leverage baseball against football. And Rozelle, first of all, wants to get him away from baseball and says, I want him in this sport. The second part of it is there's this upstart league, which is the USFL, which at the time Donald Trump was just getting involved with as an owner of the New Jersey Generals. But they had some people who wanted to make a splash, and Herschel Walker, signed with the USFL to go play for Trump eventually. Um, so there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of competition for players. Jim Kelly, who got drafted by Buffalo, went and played in the USFL. They're trying to they were trying to get players. That's definitely true. Um, and so Roselle is concerned about all of that. Okay, they're also coming off of a player strike in uh, in 1982. So there's the NFL is kind of wounded because people, the networks and the fans are sitting here going, you know, you missed basically half the season last year. What's going on here? So they're trying to solve that. Um, there's just a lot up in the air. And all of a sudden, in the middle of all that chaos, that sort of turmoil about competition between sports and who's paying what, you get the guy who's considered the greatest quarterback ever, or the greatest prospect at quarterback ever, who's part of a group of quarterbacks, of six guys who ended up going in the first round. This bevy of guys at a time when the game is changing and going to be more influenced by quarterbacks than ever before because of the way the rules change. You get the number one prospect, and like half the NFL is interested. Now it comes down to five or six teams that have the wherewithal to do it. But John Elway was so good that Bill Walsh, who was coaching the 49ers and had already won a Super Bowl with Joe Montana, thought about making the trade to go get Elway and get rid of Montana. That's how good he was. It was so good that the San Diego Chargers thought about that they were going to make a trade for Elway, even though they had Dan Fouts, an eventual Hall of Fame quarterback, playing for them. You know, you know, the Raiders push all in to try and make this trade happen. And the one place that Pete Rozelle won't let John Elway play is the Raiders. And so the NFL gets in the way of it. So there's a lineup of teams that were interested in making the deal for Elway, but it just never happens. They all get spooked by something gets in the way of doing it. But the Baltimore Colts end up taking him, and the Baltimore Colts were complete chaos at that time. They had an owner in Bob Irsay who interfered all the time, was not terribly good at managing a team, was a bit of a drunk himself, who was also at war with the city of Baltimore. Famously, they moved a year later from Baltimore to Indianapolis. So there's everything going on here. Elway gets drafted by Baltimore. Elway publicly kind of throws a hissy fit and says, I'll never play for them because he has told them before the draft I don't want to play for Baltimore. Trade my rights. They end up drafting him anyways, and it takes days until after the draft for a deal to finally be worked out between Denver and Baltimore. And the backstory, which you read, of the relationship between Edgar Kaiser, the owner of the Broncos at the time, and Bob Irsay, was a happenstance relationship that Kaiser was able to wait out and finally work a deal to get Elway and make it all unfold and all come together. And it's a bit of a minor miracle that he ends up in Denver in what is ends up being a steal of a trade. Uh, you know, the Baltimore Colts ended up with a guy named Chris Hinton, had a terrific career. They ended up with a couple of other players who were okay. They didn't end up with anything close to what Elway was, but it is a circus atmosphere for a good, if you count all the months leading up to the draft, it's probably 3 months of a complete circus before Elway ends up in Denver in one of the greatest trades in NFL history.
Do you think that I guess we'll stick specifically to quarterbacks. Do you think that quarterbacks still possess that amount of power? I mean, I've heard it in the past with other quarterbacks where they say, "Oh, I don't want to play for the Bears or whatever," but I've never really seen it play out to the point where quarterbacks
Well,
still have the amount of
Eli
power that
Manning,
Elway had in the '83 draft.
Eli Manning, Eli Manning,
That's fair.
yeah, didn't refuse to play. Kelly Stouffer, who people don't really remember because he didn't have a great career, but he refused to play for I think it was the St. Louis Cardinals, either the St. Louis Cardinals or the Arizona Cardinals. I can't remember exactly where they were at the moment. So guys have done it. Um, even Bo Jackson. Bo Jackson, not even a quarterback, um, successfully said, "I'm not playing for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers." Players have more power than they're sometimes willing to exert because they're not willing to take the negativity and the negative press that goes with exerting that power. But yeah, they have that power. You can call your shot and say, "I'm not playing for you," if you're really willing to go the distance, and you'll get what you want eventually. But you have to put up with the fact that the fans are going to hate you. And for a long time, fans hated John Elway, and Terry Bradshaw stirred a lot of that hatred with the way that he talked about Elway before the draft and said, you don't want to leave California, you don't want to leave the West Coast. Well, why don't you just play baseball? He mocked him basically. Um, but yeah, I still think that quarterbacks hold that kind of power. Like if Caleb Williams didn't want to play for Chicago this year, um, he probably could have gotten out of it. Joe Burrow, if he didn't want to go to Cincinnati, he could have gotten out of it. But you have to be willing to tolerate the crap that goes with it.
Really quick, I want to go back to Elway's greatness. And you mentioned it in terms of the prospect that he was, but you had a quote in here from an NFL exec, Bill Polian, who said that every quarterback is a version of either Andrew Luck or John Elway, depending on what era you look at. What can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, it's always about, do you have the size? Do you have the intelligence? I mean, do you have the accuracy? Do you have the decision making to go with it? Are you a big man who can handle, the physical nature of playing the position? Can you move and run well enough to create? Do you have, all the qualities that you measure, and you can prioritize them in different ways? And again, I come back to the number one and number two are your decision making and your accuracy, but those are not alone. There's arm strength, there's running ability, there's size, there's all these things. There are leaderships, and it's all sorts of intangible things. And when you look at it, yeah, John Elway is the prototype, and Andrew Luck was the next version of that prototype, and then he got hurt and didn't want to deal with the pain anymore. So yeah, that's what Polian's talking about. That's what you want to have when you draw it up. That's what you want to look at. So even as much as like a Jaden Daniels this year is having a fantastic year, when you look at Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams the same way, they're small dudes. You can't get around that. Now they're talented, and you're going to take them, and you're going to work with them. But like you better protect their ass, or they ain't going to be playing very long. If you let those guys get hit too much, it's going to be a short career. That's just the way that it works out. Um, so you want to have the sturdy guy who can move around and create. And again, the game is primarily played from the pocket. The geometry, the math that goes with playing football and being a quarterback still depends on being in the middle of the field most of the time, so that you can deliver throws all over the field and not just to one side or the other. Right? And people don't really understand that part of it, and that's what goes into making a guy being a prototype, and that's why Elway is a prototype. I think what Polian called him the statue of David of quarterbacks. He's the representation of what man is supposed to look like, or in this case, quarterback is supposed to look like.